Story number one. In 2006, something happened to me that I still can't explain, no matter how much I try to make sense of it. I was in my dorm room pulling another late-night gaming session on World of Warcraft. You know how it goes. It was probably around 3 or 4 a.m., the kind of hour where everything feels strange anyway. My roommate and I had bunked our beds. He slept on the top bunk, and my desk was at an angle, so while I faced my screen, I could still see the beds in my peripheral vision. At some point during the night, I noticed my roommate stir in his bed. I saw him sit up, swing his legs over the side, and jump down to the floor. When his feet hit the ground, I even felt the floor shake a bit. Those dorm floors weren't exactly sturdy. He started walking toward the door, heading in the direction of the bathrooms down the hall. It seemed totally normal, so I went back to focusing on my game. Then after a few seconds, I noticed the door never opened. That's when I got this weird feeling. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see him fumbling with the door or standing nearby. But there was no one there. Confused, I turned to check the beds. And to my surprise, there he was, fast asleep in the top bunk, wrapped up in his blanket like he hadn't moved an inch. My stomach dropped. I knew I had seen him jump down from the bed. I felt the vibration of his landing. I saw him walking toward the door. But now here he was, sleeping peacefully, like none of that had ever happened. At first, I tried to brush it off. I thought maybe I was just tired from staying up too late. You know how your brain plays tricks on you when you're running on fumes, but something about it felt too real. I knew what I saw. It wasn't a blurry, dreamlike thing. It was vivid, like something I experienced in real time. It shook me enough that I couldn't stop thinking about it, even as I finished my raid and finally climbed into bed. The next morning, I couldn't help but tell my roommate about what had happened. We were sitting at breakfast, and I casually brought it up. I said something like, "Dude, did you get up in the middle of the night? Because I swear I saw you jump down from the bunk and walk toward the door, but when I checked, you were still in bed." As soon as I finished, his expression changed completely. His face went pale, and he looked genuinely scared. I could tell he wasn't messing with me. "Okay, that's really weird," he said. And then he told me what had happened on his end that night. Apparently, after I had climbed into bed, he felt the bed shake, just like how it always does with bunk beds when someone climbs in or out. He fell asleep shortly after, but at some point in the night, he woke up. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was a noise or just one of those moments where you randomly wake up in the middle of the night. That's when he saw me, or at least he thought he did. He said that in the dim light from our alarm clocks, he saw me standing in the corner of the room, right by the closets. I wasn't moving. I was just standing there, perfectly still. He stared at me for a few moments, wondering what I was doing. Then he called my name softly, but I didn't respond. And then, as soon as he blinked, just like that, I was gone. At this point, my roommate was pretty freaked out. He leaned over the side of the bunk to check if I was in my bed, and there I was, sound asleep under my blanket, exactly where I had been all along. He thought it was strange, but he eventually just shrugged it off and went back to sleep. When he told me this, I felt the same chill I had felt the night before. What were the odds that we both experienced something so similar on the same night? I saw him get out of bed and walk toward the door, but he never actually moved. He saw me standing in the corner, but I had been asleep the whole time. Neither of us had a history of sleepwalking, and nothing like this had ever happened before or after that night. We tried to laugh it off at breakfast, but the truth is, it really unsettled both of us. It wasn't just a creepy coincidence. It felt like something beyond what we could explain. I've heard stories about doppelgangers before, but I never thought I'd experience anything like that firsthand. Story number 2. This happened back when I was in college, and I still can't make sense of it. It was just a normal morning, or at least it started that way. My roommate had gotten up earlier than me, and I remember hearing her leave the room to take a shower. I wasn't feeling too great. I'd gone out drinking the night before, and the hangover was starting to hit me pretty hard. I grabbed my laptop and tried to distract myself for a few minutes, but the nausea made it impossible to focus. So I gave up, turned toward the wall, and curled into the fetal position, hoping I'd feel better if I just rested for a bit. That's when things got weird. After lying there for only a few seconds, I felt something heavy shift the end of my bed. It was the distinct sensation of weight pressing down on the mattress, like someone had sat down. Then the weight shifted slowly, just like when someone lies down next to you, getting comfortable. I could feel the impression move along the bed until it stopped right at my level. I knew for sure no one was supposed to be there. My roommate was still in the shower, and the door hadn't opened. But the weight on the bed felt so real I could even feel it subtly move as if someone was breathing. And then I saw her. It's hard to describe what I saw in that moment. My eyes were half shut, fluttering in and out of focus. I wasn't dreaming. I was awake, but I couldn't fully control my body. Between the wall and my knees, crammed into the tiny space, I saw my roommate's face. She was staring at me with her eyes wide open, her expression blank, as if she wasn't really there. What really freaked me out was that she wasn't just staring, she was chanting. It sounded like complete nonsense. Strange words I didn't recognize, spoken in a low, rhythmic voice. Her lips were moving steadily, and her eyes never blinked. It felt surreal, like I was looking at someone else entirely, wearing my roommate's face. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't move. I tried to open my eyes wider, but they kept fluttering shut, like I was on the verge of sleep but stuck in that hazy in-between state. It was terrifying. I could see her, hear her muttering nonsense, and feel the weight of someone next to me. But I couldn't fully wake up or react. Then just like that, everything vanished. The weight lifted from the bed, her face disappeared, and the room went completely silent. I lay there frozen, trying to process what had just happened. My heart was racing, and for a second, I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. But then, for some stupid reason, I closed my eyes again, almost like I wanted to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The second I shut my eyes, it all started happening again. The bed sank under the weight of someone sitting down. The heavy presence shifted, moving until it was right beside me. And there she was again, my roommate's face, pressed between my knees and the wall, her wide open eyes staring into mine. She started chanting again, that same strange, incomprehensible string of words. This time I panicked. I forced my eyes open, wide awake now, and just like before, everything was gone. The weight on the bed, the chanting, her face, it all vanished in an instant, leaving me alone in the silent room. When my roommate finally came back from her shower, I told her everything. I was still freaked out and hoping she'd give me some kind of logical explanation. But of course, she didn't believe me. She just gave me a weird look, probably assuming I was still drunk or hallucinating from the night before. I've thought about it so many times, trying to figure out if it was some kind of vivid dream, sleep paralysis, or just a hallucination from being hungover. But it didn't feel like any of those things. I was awake. I could feel the weight on the bed, hear the chanting in my ear, and see my roommate's face so clearly. If I hadn't opened my eyes when I did, what would have happened next? Story number 3. When I was 13 years old, something happened that still sticks with me to this day. It was just a normal afternoon. Me and my best friend were sitting in the kitchen, drinking lemonade and hanging out. We were home alone, chatting about random stuff, and everything felt completely normal. From where we sat, we had a clear view of the corridor that runs from the front door all the way to the backyard. The house was quiet, and nothing seemed out of place. But in the middle of our conversation, both of us suddenly stopped talking at the exact same time. Something had shifted in the room, and it made us both fall silent without saying a word. We turned our heads toward the corridor, and that's when we saw it. A tall shadow, shaped like a man, walking through the hallway. The figure wasn't hurried, just walking slowly and steadily, carrying a suitcase in one hand. It moved as if it had someplace to go, heading down the corridor toward the back door. For a second, we were both frozen, trying to process what we were seeing. Neither of us said anything until the shadow disappeared down the hall. Then, almost in sync, we turned to each other with wide eyes. "You saw that too, right?" I asked, feeling my heart race. My friend nodded, her face pale. "Yeah, a man with a suitcase." We sat there stunned. We hadn't imagined it. There was no way. We both saw the same thing, and when we compared what we saw, our descriptions matched exactly. A tall shadow with the outline of a suitcase. No other features, just this dark figure, silent and deliberate in its movement. The weirdest part was that we hadn't heard anything. No footsteps, no doors opening or closing, just that shadow gliding through the house. After a few moments of sitting there in shock, we ran to check the hallway. But of course, there was nothing there. The house was completely still, just like it had been before. For a while after that, I couldn't stop thinking about the shadow man. My friend and I talked about it a lot, trying to make sense of what we saw, but we couldn't come up with any reasonable explanation. We didn't tell our parents. It just didn't seem like something they'd believe. And as the months passed, the memory of the shadow started to fade. It was still unsettling, but since nothing else weird happened after that, I eventually stopped thinking about it. That was until a few years later, when it happened again. By that point, I had almost forgotten about the shadow man with the suitcase. Life went on, and I figured maybe it had just been a weird trick of the light or something. Something spooky that had no real meaning. But then I had to do a school project with another girl from class. She was someone I didn't know all that well, but we had to work together. So I invited her over to my house one afternoon. I was home alone again, working on the computer in my room, waiting for her to show up. When she arrived, I heard her come inside, so I called out from my room to let her know I'd be there in a second. She called back, but there was a weird tone in her voice, like she was confused about something. When I walked out to meet her, she was standing near the stairs looking uneasy. "Where's your dad?" she asked. I gave her a puzzled look. "He's not here. He's at work," I said. Her expression changed and she shifted uncomfortably. "Are you sure?" she asked, glancing toward the stairs. "Because I swear I just saw a man walk downstairs with a suitcase right before you came out." My stomach dropped. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, and all the memories of that day with my friend came rushing back. I stood there for a second, trying to process what she had just said. I hadn't told anyone else about the shadow man, not even my family. But here she was, telling me she had seen the same thing. A man carrying a suitcase, walking through my house as if he belonged there. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I tried to stay calm. "There's no one else here," I told her, forcing a laugh to make the situation feel less creepy. "It's just us." She gave me a strange look, like she wasn't sure whether to believe me or not. We ended up working on our project like nothing happened, but the whole time I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. After that, I became really anxious about being home alone. Every time I heard the slightest noise in the house, my mind would go back to the shadow man. I kept expecting to see him again, maybe walking through the hallway, maybe standing at the top of the stairs. But no matter how much I dreaded it, he never showed up again. No one else in my family ever saw the shadow man. My parents brushed it off as one of those silly things kids make up, and I never told them about the second time with the girl from school. They would have thought I was crazy, and honestly, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. But how could two different people, years apart, see the exact same thing in the same house? Was it just a coincidence? A shared hallucination? Or was there really something or someone moving through our house, carrying that suitcase to wherever it needed to go? I don't know, but just because I haven't seen him since doesn't mean he's not there. Story number 4. When I was a kid, probably somewhere between 2nd and 5th grade, I experienced a few things that I still can't fully explain. Looking back, I might have had a poltergeist, or maybe I didn't. I consider myself a skeptic now, but the things that happened back then have stuck with me all these years. I promise everything I'm about to tell you is 100% true, even though I know it sounds crazy. Growing up, I was raised by my grandmother, and she had a thing for porcelain dolls. She would buy them for me to decorate my room, but I wasn't allowed to play with them. They were strictly for display, lined up on shelves, watching from their spots like little silent spectators. I didn't mind at the time. I actually liked having them, even if they creeped out my friends. But the rule was clear: no playing with the dolls. They were only for looking. Now, I have to admit, I was a bit of a problem child back then. I had a bad attitude and a temper, always getting upset about the smallest things. One day I got mad over something completely dumb, who knows what it was, and stomped off to my room, fuming. The dolls were displayed on high shelves that I couldn't reach without help, and one of them was a beautiful doll dressed in a white wedding gown. It had always been my favorite, though I never got to play with it. As soon as I walked into the room, still annoyed and sulking, the weirdest thing happened. That wedding dress doll flew off the top shelf, flew all the way across the room and landed squarely on my bed. Now let me be clear. This wasn't just a case of the doll falling off the shelf. The shelf was on the opposite side of the room from my bed, a good distance away. If it had simply fallen, it would have landed on the floor, not on the bed. But there it was, lying on the covers like someone had placed it there on purpose. I just stood there, staring, my heart racing. I didn't know what to think. At that age, my first thought wasn't that something paranormal had happened. I just thought the doll had somehow jumped down so I could play with it. So that's exactly what I did. I climbed onto my bed and started playing with it. A few minutes later, my grandmother walked in and immediately asked how the doll got off the shelf. I told her the truth. It flew across the room and landed on my bed. She didn't believe me, of course. She assumed I had somehow climbed up and grabbed it myself. I tried to explain that I couldn't have reached it. It was way too high. But she just gave me that look like, "Sure, kid," and told me to put it back. That wasn't the only strange thing that happened in that house. For as long as I can remember, I had a lot of weird experiences, especially at night. There were many nights when I woke up to the entire bed shaking, like there was an earthquake happening right under me. But earthquakes weren't a thing where we lived. I never heard anything about tremors or seismic activity in our area, and the shaking felt too localized. Just my bed, like something was physically shaking it. Then there was the sleepwalking. I never understood it at the time, but I would go to bed in my room and wake up somewhere else in the house. Sometimes I'd wake up on the couch in the living room, and other times I'd find myself in the basement. Now, our basement wasn't creepy or unfinished like you might imagine. It was fully furnished with a playroom and a family living room down there, but it was still unsettling to wake up somewhere totally different from where I'd gone to sleep. I'd have no memory of how I got there, just this strange, lingering sense that something wasn't quite right. These strange occurrences happened on and off throughout my childhood. But then, in 2006, everything stopped. That was the year my grandmother passed away, and after that, the weird experiences just ended. No more bed shaking, no more sleepwalking. It was like whatever strange energy had been in the house was tied to her in some way, and when she was gone, it left with her. But the story doesn't end there. After my grandmother passed, my aunt bought the house and moved in. She hasn't experienced anything like the things I did growing up. No flying dolls, no shaking beds, nothing out of the ordinary. But there is one thing that keeps happening. Every year on the anniversary of my grandmother's death, my aunt smells her perfume. It's not just a faint whiff either. It's like someone sprayed it right in the room. And it only happens on that specific day. I've visited the house a few times since my aunt moved in, and it always feels normal now, like any other house. But every time I walk down the hallway toward my old room, I get this weird, heavy feeling, like something is still lingering there, watching quietly. Story number 5. I'm not sure if what happened to me was supernatural or just some strange coincidence, but it still freaks me out. It's one of those moments that makes you feel weird in a way that's not exactly bad, but definitely unsettling. I've carried it with me ever since. I've been friends with the same group of girls for as long as I can remember, since we were around 5 or 6 years old. We were the kind of friends who did everything together, from sleepovers to school dances. As the years passed, we stayed close, and by the time we were 18, we thought we had our whole lives ahead of us. Then one day, everything changed. One of us, let's call her Sarah, was killed in a brutal car accident. She lost control of her car, hit a tree, and snapped her neck. The news hit all of us like a freight train. I couldn't wrap my head around it. One day she was there, the next she was gone. We were devastated. Grief pulled us all into a strange kind of haze. None of us knew how to process the fact that someone we had known and loved for so long was suddenly gone. For months after the funeral, I kept thinking about her, about the last time I saw her, the things I never got to say, and the memories we would never make. It was like my brain refused to accept that she was really gone. A few months later, I had this dream. In the dream, I was back at high school, standing in one of the hallways we used to hang out in. And there she was, Sarah, looking just like she always had. I felt this rush of emotion and immediately went up to her. "I miss you so much," I told her. "I'm so sorry about what happened." I expected her to be sad or to tell me it was okay. But instead, she looked right at me with this weird, serious expression and said, "No, I'm not dead. It's all a fraud." I woke up suddenly, my heart racing. For a moment, I just lay there trying to make sense of what I had just dreamed. It felt so real, like I had actually talked to her. But at the same time, I knew it couldn't be real. She was gone, and nothing could change that. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Dreams are weird like that, right? They can mess with your emotions and leave you feeling off even after you wake up. I didn't think much of it at the time, just another strange dream during a hard time. But then the next day, something happened that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I got a call from one of my other friends from the group. As soon as she started talking, I could tell something was bothering her. She said, "I had the weirdest dream about Sarah last night." That got my attention immediately. "What kind of dream?" I asked, trying to stay calm. She paused for a moment, almost as if she didn't know how to explain it. "We were back at our high school," she said, and she told me she wasn't really dead. Every muscle in my body tensed up. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was the exact same dream, right down to the setting and the message. I hadn't told anyone about my dream, not even her, and yet somehow she had experienced the same thing. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and my skin broke out in goosebumps. It was one of the strangest moments of my life, realizing that somehow we had shared the same dream about Sarah. I didn't know what to think. Was it just some crazy coincidence? Or was there something more to it, something we couldn't understand? Story number 6. This happened back in the summer of 1995. I still remember it vividly because it's one of the weirdest, most unexplainable things that has ever happened to me. I was sitting in my office chair just relaxing. My computer was off and I wasn't doing much of anything, just sitting there breathing normally, letting my mind wander. At some point, I decided to close my eyes and rest for a bit, more out of boredom than anything else. For some reason, I got the idea to experiment with my body's energy. I imagined that my energy levels were like a radio frequency, and I decided to assign my usual resting energy to a radio station, 98.5. It was a random number, but it felt right. I figured this would represent my normal state, just to see what would happen if I started adjusting it, tuning it down or up like a radio dial. I started lowering the number just one step at a time, 98.4, 98.3, 98.2, each tiny change coming with a slight shift in how I felt. At first it was subtle, just like adjusting the volume on a quiet song. But as I dropped into the lower 90s, things began to change. A heaviness set in, and it felt like I was sinking into something dark. It was a sensation I can barely describe. Like everything around me was getting denser, heavier, more oppressive. It wasn't painful exactly, but it was uncomfortable, and it gave me the sense that going lower wasn't a good idea. I felt like if I kept tuning down, something bad would happen. So I stopped. I decided to go back to my original setting of 98.5 and reset myself, shaking off the strange, heavy feeling. Once I felt back to normal, I thought, why not try going higher instead? Maybe I'd feel lighter, clearer, or energized. So I started tuning up, going one notch at a time, 98.6, 98.7, 98.8. At first it felt kind of nice, like my body was waking up, buzzing with a subtle vibration. Then something strange happened. I began to feel my pulse, not just in my chest or wrist, but at the tips of all my fingers. It was a weird sensation. I've never felt my pulse so clearly in each fingertip before. The higher I went on this imaginary frequency, the more I could feel pulses everywhere throughout my body, like dozens or even hundreds of tiny beats happening all at once. It was overwhelming, but fascinating. I didn't want to stop. I kept pushing higher and higher, curious to see what would happen next. Then all at once, everything changed. The pulses stopped abruptly, like someone had hit a switch. Suddenly, my body felt completely still, as if everything inside me had gone silent. The air around me was eerily calm, too calm, and then, without warning, I felt and heard a distinct, sharp pop. The sound was so real it startled me. It felt like the kind of pop you'd hear when something bursts, and I could feel it inside my head. I remember thinking, what the hell was that? My heart started racing, but I told myself to stay calm, to stick with it and see what would happen next. I didn't want to freak out just yet. But then something even stranger happened. I felt someone blow air into my right ear. Not just a breeze or a draft, it was like a deliberate, focused puff of air, as if someone was standing right beside me, blowing directly into my ear. I froze. You know that feeling when someone blows into your ear and it tickles? It was exactly like that, except I was alone in my apartment. I sat there, paralyzed with fear, but too curious to stop. A few seconds passed, and then it happened again. Another puff of air, right into my ear. It was so real I could almost feel the breath behind it. My heart was pounding at this point. I wanted to open my eyes, jump out of my chair, and run out of the room, but something kept me there. I wanted to know what would happen next. Then I heard it. A voice started speaking to me, right in my ear. It was a male voice, calm and conversational, like someone casually chatting with a friend about their day. The weirdest part was the language. It wasn't anything I recognized. It wasn't English or any other language I knew. It just sounded foreign, like a string of words I couldn't make sense of, but spoken with the rhythm of normal conversation. That was the moment I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped out of my chair, heart pounding in my chest, and opened my eyes. The room was silent, exactly as it had been before I started. There was no one there. I was completely alone, just like I had been the whole time. I stood there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I even checked the apartment to make sure no one had somehow gotten in, but everything was locked. There was no one there but me. To this day, I still can't explain what happened that night. It was too real to be a dream, and it didn't feel like some random trick of my mind. I've never experienced anything like it before or since. All I know is that it felt real, down to the puff of air in my ear and the sound of that voice speaking to me in a language I couldn't understand. I've thought about trying the experiment again, just to see if I could recreate it. But every time I think about that voice, about how normal it sounded, like it belonged to someone who was right there with me, I get a knot in my stomach. I've never tried it again, and honestly, I don't think I ever will. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.